Bonjour, mon nom est Pascale Fournier, je suis professeure à la section de droit civil à la Faculté de droit à l'Université d'Ottawa et je suis privilégiée d'être récipiendaire cette année du Fonds pour le futur de l'apprentissage. J'ai la grande chance, le grand privilège de travailler en étroite collaboration avec une femme autochtone qui m'inspire beaucoup depuis de nombreuses années, Dr. Dawn Lavell-Harvard. Donc, une femme qui a été très importante et qui le demeure dans notre paysage canadien, qui a beaucoup travaillé dans le domaine du droit des femmes autochtones et qui est au centre de cette décision dont on parle beaucoup de la Cour suprême du Canada, la décision Lavell. De nombreuses femmes autochtones à travers le pays ont perdu leur statut, ont perdu leur appartenance au groupe, à la communauté, à la terre pendant tellement d'années au Canada. Et c'est grâce au travail de notre collaboratrice, à sa mère en particulier, qui s'est rendue jusqu'en Cour suprême du Canada, Jeannette Corbière Lavell. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm very touched to have received this fund and to be working with you because there's a call right now. There's a moment, a historical moment in universities to take seriously the recommendations on integration of Indigenous students, on reconciliation, on understanding the history, understanding the past, but most importantly, on correcting the present and building a future that's much more inclusive. You have such a beautiful legacy. I teach constitutional law, the charter. I teach the Lavell decision, right? Your name is Dr. Lavell-Harvard. And could you tell us a little bit about that history, that case, what it meant for you as a child and growing up as the wonderful woman that you are? Such an inspiring model for us.
Thank you. I think when I think about the Lavell case, I realize that it's something that has literally shaped my entire life. I was that baby in my mother's arms when she was, going to the Supreme Court, when she was undergoing these challenges. And, because as we all know, tragically, they lost by one vote in the Supreme Court. And it took women like Jeannette and then taking on by Sandra Lovelace and Sharon McIver, literally 49 and a half years to finally get her original status back. So that decision, that court case, that status issue has literally defined my entire life. I thought everybody's family did protests on the weekend and, arts and crafts time was making signs. It wasn't until I got sort of to high school that I realized that not everybody's family did that. But it was this issue of the right to belong in our communities. And for my mother, for Jeannette, it wasn't about not paying taxes. It wasn't about, these special rights. It's about the survival of our people. Because for every woman, her children and grandchildren that is lost from the communities, that's feeding into the eventual extinction of our nations. And so this struggle, this 49-year struggle to get her status back, to have the right to belong for her children and grandchildren, is literally about the survival of our First Nations people and our First Nations specifically.
And often people in Canada don't know that under the Indian Act, when an Indigenous woman would marry a non-Indigenous man, she would lose status. Her kids would no longer be part of the group under the law. I mean, this is quite special. But the Indigenous man who would marry a non-Indigenous woman, that woman would gain status. The kids would gain status. So a real clear case of sex discrimination. I mean, sex discrimination, race discrimination, a mix of both. Have you found, doing all your wonderful activism, that people know about this, or that there's more sensitivity to that issue and the role of Indigenous women who speak the language, who raise their kids, who actually were the ones being excluded when they were so linked to the family, linked to the culture, to the language. So as an Indigenous feminist woman, you have held different leadership positions. You've done wonderful work around the country working with Indigenous women. Do you find that Canadians know about that, or there's a lot of learning to do still?
I think there's a lot of learning that still has to happen. Although it's interesting, more and more, I'll go somewhere and I will say, you know, my mother is Jeanette Corby-Lavell, and every so often you will have somebody say, oh my God, I learned about her in my law class. I took this class, or an Indigenous studies class, or on occasion I'll have somebody come forward and say, I have my status back. I have the right to return to my community because of your mom. And we'll have people just walk up to her randomly on the street and thank her for standing up because it's what allowed them and their family to return. But when you think about the original Indian Act and this notion, it's so founded in the notion that women and children are property. Because under those original sections of the Indian Act, an Indian was a status Indian man, the wife of an Indian man, or the child of an Indian man. So she was originally, you know, had full 6-1 status because essentially she was the child of her father. But then when she married somebody who was non-Indian, and I use the word Indian even though it is an offensive term and we don't use it, it is still the Indian Act. And that's important for people to remember, that it's not the Indigenous Act. There is no such thing. We are still functioning under the Indian Act. And in fact, that in itself is something that has been very hotly contested, very debated, is why is she bothering, why are these women bothering to be reinstated under the Indian Act when the whole act is fundamentally colonial and designed to exterminate our people? You know, we should throw out the Indian Act and replace it with something else. But the challenge is that if we are going to sit around the table and around that council fire and talk about what's going to replace the Indian Act, because right now the Indian Act is, you know, one of the legislations that protects what little rights we do have left. If we're going to talk about what's replacing that Indian Act, our women, our mothers and grandmothers, and our daughters and their children and grandchildren need to have a seat at that table, need to be part of that conversation if we're going to talk about the future of our nations. And that's why there's essentially a chronology issue here, that we need to right the wrong. We need to have our women and their children and grandchildren reinstated to our nations, and then collectively we can decide what the future of our nations is going to be, because that's what it was always supposed to be. When we see this very notion that women and children are property, that came to these shores along with the cholera and the typhoid and the smallpox and all those other diseases they brought with them. They brought these patriarchal ideas that women and children are property, because that's not the way it was here. Our women, our mothers and grandmothers, you know, they had a say in our communities and in our families and in our nations. We know, you know, many communities were matrilineal, which meant that you traced your lineage. Many were matrilocal, you lived with your mother and your mother's line, which also protected against a lot of the domestic violence that we are seeing now. Because if you're with your mother and your family and your brothers and your father and grandfather and all of your male relatives, you know, there's a protective factor there that was really important. And women had power, decision-making power in our nations. We have seen some of the earliest treaties, in fact, were signed by both the women and the men, but which was something that was, I'm sure, absolutely appalling to those colonizers, those British lords who came over, because they couldn't imagine, you know, if their women saw that how do you tell women that this is natural and it's meant to be by God, that women should be subservient, that women are children are property, if they come to an entire nation where women are equals? It throws the entire system, their entire worldview into disarray. And that's why it was so important on an ideological level to essentially put women in their place. And we often heard, you know, priests telling the men that in the community, priests and the Indian agent telling the men that they had to learn how to put women in their place. And we see it's also part of that overall process of colonization, that in order to exterminate a nation of peoples, because First Nations are eliminating those First Nations is the goal of colonization. You know, we have to have a very real conversation about that and understanding that this is all connected to that colonization process, that goal of eliminating First Nations peoples, eliminating First Nations by eliminating people, by eliminating women in all those generations that she would have had.
We are here talking in a space that's an Indigenous space that we have at the University of Ottawa. Things are moving in a good direction. There's still a lot of work to be done, but in that spirit of reconciliation, we are elsewhere from like 20 years ago, let's say. If I were to ask you, universities are a space of knowledge. They are a space of learning about yourself, learning about ideas, learning to become a leader, someone who will bring a difference in the world and work with communities. What can universities do to commit better, or to be more inclusive, or to have that kind of dialogue? I'm not Indigenous. We are working together and we're building together. What's the way of the future so that there's that kind of relationship of harmony in some ways, and that we can walk hand in hand towards reconciliation? What would be your advice?
Well, and I think this is something that people often ask me, in fact. What are the steps to move towards reconciliation? What can we do? And we need to remember that it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So step number one, that very first step, needs to be the truth. We need to have truth first. We need to expose the truth. We need to shine a light on that truth. And we need to sit in that place of discomfort, because it's not a beautiful, settlers kind of story. There's a very dark, ugly history in Canada. And, our people didn't just vanish. There was a process, and a very deliberate process, of eliminating Indigenous peoples. We are not responsible for that. You or I are not responsible for that. But this is where we need to shine a light on it. We need to bear witness. We need to understand, because only then can we understand how we got to where we are and how we can work together moving forward. Right. And it's one of those things that very often as Indigenous people, we hear people say, why don't you people just get over it? These things happened a long time ago. And it was not until those first 215 unmarked graves were found that there was this gentleman who was in Peterborough who came out. We had all these little moccasins on the ground representing those unmarked graves. And he said, I finally understand. And he said, I finally understand because I take care of my granddaughter. Our daughter brings her over first thing in the morning. She has breakfast with us. And then I put her little backpack on and I walk her to the school every day. She's in kindergarten. And I hand her over to the kindergarten teacher. And he said, if I came back at 3 o'clock and she wasn't here, he said, I would never forgive myself. I could never face my daughter. And he said, there's not enough whiskey in the world to take away that kind of pain. So I finally understand what drives some of the addictions, what drives some of the challenges, it's about the breakdown of community. And he said, I finally get it, that you might heal, you try to move forward, like those veterans who on Remembrance Day, no one would ever dare look at them and say, hey, Frank, the war ended a long time ago. Why don't you get over it? Because we understand that there's certain things you never get over. But you can heal. You can try to move forward. And an important part of that is acknowledging what happened, understanding, and then moving forward from that place in a good way together. Not trying to deny it, but understanding that we're carrying that with us, and then doing things with the incredible privilege that we have. Right. I mean, both you and I have amazing educations, amazing opportunities, and what do we do with that opportunity that we've been given to shine a light on that history, to then bring people together? And it's okay to feel discomfort, and I think that's the biggest thing, because looking at that history is not comfortable. It is but we can't turn away. And even if it means we have to look at it, turn away for a while, and then come back to it and face it again and again until we really are able to understand that history, the complexity of that history, then we're able to do things together in a really positive way moving forward. And if that means, supporting Indigenous students to get an education, coming to these spaces where, educating each other, bearing witness to that history so that we can understand. And I think that's one of the most fundamental things is we have an activity that we call Just Get Over It. It's in honor of literally that. And it helps walk people through that process of colonization and many of the things. And time after time, I hear people say, I had no idea.
Exactly.
I had no idea that's what happened. I had no idea there were gates at the edge of the First Nations, in the reserves that were locked at a certain point in the night. I had no idea that, even though we're saying First Nations people, we want them to become farmers and settle down, but the government passed rules that said they can't buy or use farm implements. Just the absurdity of the whole thing. I had no idea that there were actually smallpox blankets deliberately given as gifts to Indigenous people. We don't think these things happen here in Canada. But by bearing witness and understanding that and sitting in that place of discomfort and being okay with that, because we know that we are not personally responsible, you or I.
Right.
But we are responsible for is doing things differently, because we haven't inherited the mess, and we have also inherited a lot of privilege. and using that, to create opportunities like this, to create opportunities to come together and create opportunities. I mean, for me specifically, using a lot of my opportunity and energy to create those opportunities for young Indigenous people who haven't had that opportunity, who maybe they're the first person in their, not just their family, but their whole community who has gone to post-secondary. And so you can imagine the strength that takes, the courage, and at the same time, so much is riding on their shoulders, because for every student who comes and succeeds, and there's those generations, the younger siblings and the cousins who are watching them, and they're that role model. At the same time, if they don't succeed, if they give up and go home, the ripple effect that has through the community, because there's all those little ones, the cousins and the other children that are watching, and they think if Jamie can't do it, how could I do it? And they lose hope. And that's why each student that comes here, we bend over backwards to do everything we can to make sure they succeed, because it's not just about them. For each student, it's about the whole community. Absolutely.
It's the model. I feel very privileged and grateful and thankful that you will host us in the community where you grew up and you are from. We will go this summer together filming you and your mom. And it's very meaningful that we're doing it, not here, but there on the land. Could you tell us about the power of the land? What does the land represent to you as a woman, as an Indigenous woman? Why is it so important for us to understand that?
I think especially as a woman, we talk about Mother Earth. We talk about this land giving us everything we need, and much the same as our own mothers did while we were growing inside. The same way that our mothers, there's a reason we call it the mother tongue. It's our mothers who are our first teachers, our mothers who teach us our culture and our language. And our Mother Earth is the one that teaches us that fundamental, important culture and connection, and that language of connecting with the earth and having that relationship. That our relationship with the land, it's not this exploitative relationship that we see in Western societies where it's all about how much we can take from it. But for us, it's about the power that literally comes from the land, the power that land where all of our ancestors are and all of those spirits are still, I believe firmly, they are still there, that energy helping us moving forward together. And everything we do, from the medicines that our ancestors knew for how to take care of our bodies, how to treat diseases, how to keep ourselves healthy, how to keep our families healthy, all of those medicines, they're very specific to a very certain portion of the land. We have students, Inuit students from the far north, that their medicines and their knowledge is very specifically tied to their land. And when they're displaced, when they're down in the territories here, that disruption of their knowledge, that disruption of their connection to the land, it can be incredibly painful, it can be incredibly disruptive. And that's why it's so important, and that's why it was so disruptive when we think of communities that were just packed up in the entire community, relocated somewhere else, because so much of our knowledge and our healing and our medicines and our ways of surviving are connected to knowledge of very specific territories, very specific lands with very specific plants and animals. And it was the interconnected of that, and that the relationship with that very specific geography in a certain place, even understanding which plants to put together to grow together in a certain part of soil, understanding those nutrients, in ways that I'm sure Guelph is only just dreaming of understanding now.
Absolutely.
Our ancestors knew that, and they had teachings that taught us how to do things in ways that replenished the earth and gave us maximum sustenance for our people. And that's why it's so important, in specific lands and understanding, we are tied to a specific area. We talked about this once, that if you took a whole group from Wikwemikong and dropped us in the middle of England or Africa somewhere, would we still be Anishinaabe? And of course we would. Of course we would. We would still be who we are, and we would still be together, and we would still speak our language, and we would still function the way we function. But it would be different. There would be something missing. Right. And it would be that connection.
That connection.
It would be, that heart, your connection to the beat of the land. And we would still exist, and we would still fight, but we'd probably always be fighting to come back, because we need that connection.
And so I feel very privileged, because often when we teach from the comfort of a law school, when we teach about the history, when we teach about Supreme Court Canada cases on Indigenous rights, we do it from the classroom, the perspective of the classroom. So we're not on the land the way you describe it. So for me to come with you and to film and bring it back to the classroom, it's a way to experience your culture, your identity, the place of the land, the place of the spirit, the gender dimension, to feel it. So to bring knowledge to another level. And you know, one day it would be wonderful to bring all of the law students on the land, right? Because then we're really on a kind of dialogue where we experience, and we, you know, knowledge can be at another level. It's still very static when we only teach from the classroom perspective and with slides and excerpts from the Supreme Court. So very grateful that we'll be able to go there together.
So I think the beauty of you coming to Manitoulin, coming to Esquimalt, coming to my home community, coming to be on the land, and I dearly hope that someday we are able to bring the students. It's always about power relationships.
Right.
And us doing this is disrupting power relationships. Absolutely. Because the history of Canada has been about the power of, you know, the colonizers, the Westerners coming in. Institutions are all about the power of these spaces.
Right.
They're deliberately designed in such a way to give you a sense of that power and the hierarchy and the linearity of the whole thing. And it is very raced. It is very racialized. It is very gendered. You know that anytime you walk into that space. And so there's a certain beauty, and we've done this with community-based learning, taking somebody out of the seat of power and taking them to the land where all of a sudden, all of the things they thought they knew are gone. All of the knowledges are not useful for them. And they're in a place where all of a sudden, you know, that power is taken away, and they feel themselves and suddenly realize, I don't know how to survive in this space. I don't know how to function.
Right?
Who am I?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Literally something has been taken away when that power is taken away and when it's disrupted. And by forcing inequality in that way, by disrupting that power relationship, it creates such a beautiful learning opportunity that can in fact be painful a little bit at first for some people who really only thrive or only feel comfortable when they're in their certain structures of power. Right. But when you take those structures of power away, it allows for a genuine connection.
Right.
But you have to be able to sit with that discomfort first and not be afraid to experience that genuine connection once that power relationship has been taken away. We took a group of students to Manitoulin, and we did on the land, like literally to an uninhabited island, and just, you know, some of them came back like truly changed by this experience, and others were absolutely terrified.
Yeah, exactly. It can really disrupt, right?
It really
and
did.
Give space to something else. Who are you as a citizen, as a woman, as a man, as a, you know, a non-binary individual? Like, who are you in the world? Why are you doing what you're doing? It really creates a space of humility, right?
And
for
who are
anyone,
you?
Right?
Who are you without all the trappings that we carry?
Exactly.
The vehicles. I mean, I remember once I was doing a presentation for my daughter's classroom and explaining that I'm Anishinaabe, and you know that meant I was an Indigenous person, you know, a Native person for this little kid to understand. You know, small town, Ontario. And this little boy looked at me and he said, "You can't be Indigenous. You know, you drive a Honda and you live on my street." I thought I couldn't quit. But in his mind, right?
The power of the
power of those cultural trappings
that we
right?
created.
All of
right?
the things that
the
we build up around ourselves, that we have to have, the cars, the homes, all of these, because they're very symbolic at the same time and protect us from nature, from the world around us. And once those things are stripped away, we have an essence of who we really are at heart. And I think that can be quite scary for some people, but it's tremendously empowering when you actually have genuine, take away all those trappings and actually just interact as, you know, really from the heart with one another.
Heart to heart.
Exactly.
So I'm going to end with one question. I've been working on the field of women's rights for pretty much all of my career, and I know that you have as well. We have that in common. And throughout these years, in the last 20 years, I think my definition of feminism has changed in some ways, probably because I work in different communities and I've try to, redefine myself, my place in that discourse of women's rights. What would be your definition of feminism as an Indigenous woman?
Oh, goodness. I think the challenge of even answering that question points to a very Western need for boxes,
Right.
for definitions, for finality.
Right.
And we need to let go of that. We need to understand that feminism it needs to be and should always be dynamic and fluid. And, especially as somebody who we all exist in intersections of our race, our culture, our language, our gender identity, our sexual identity, all of these important things. And so very strategically, when we think about feminism, when we were talking about the discrimination against my mother, against Indian women under the Indian Act, at a very particular time, there was an importance to align with other women because this was a discrimination based on sex and gender. Yeah. At other points in our lives, there's an importance to be more allied with our Indigenous communities, with our Indigenous men in our communities, because we are being discriminated against, we are being oppressed because of that Indigenous identity. Other times in the world, it's, people of color, people who are marginalized, the importance of coming together with other people who have been oppressed, other nations. And so I think that's something that feminism needs to remember, is that there are so many other aspects.
The intersectionality.
The intersection is absolutely critical that we can, and even what my definition is today, or even how I enact it and how I feel my feminism today, can be very different.
Right.
2 weeks from now if I'm at Parliament, or 3 weeks from now if I'm in a First Nation community. And I think context and it really is, it has to be strategic, and it has to be fluid, and it has to be responding to the context.
Right.
And I think that's the most important aspect of feminism, is that intersectionality and that understanding of being strategic and being understanding context.
Right.
And I think,
and
especially
how it's to be received, right?
Exactly.
Your narrative, you want it to advance equality or advance.
And I think the most
right.
important thing as sisters, as women, that we can do is not speak for others.
Right.
I mean, even within a First Nations community, even within First Nations women in Wacomico, I wouldn't dare to say that my experience represents anybody else's, even for women in my own community. The most important thing we can do is focus on making spaces for women to have their voices heard, right. for others to speak for themselves. And I think it's that plurality of voices and making space for those voices, for people to be empowered to speak for themselves, really should be the number one goal of feminism, for women's rights, for people to speak for their own experience, and obviously to eliminate discrimination, to eliminate, but not just the very overt, in-your-face kinds of things.
Right.
Understanding those microaggressions, understanding the ways that literally the physicality of the spaces we're in tells us in so many ways every day that we don't belong here, that this was not designed for you.
It regulates how we are, how we behave, our speech, so that kind of disciplinary power is so important.